So you're frustrated with your airbrush? Well, in this video, I'm going to share with you 3 common airbrush issues which can cause you some frustration, and I'm going to show you how to fix them. Let's get into it right now. Frustration number 1, not being able to touch the surface when you're airbrushing. So when you're drawing with a pencil, you're touching the surface. Same goes for when you're using a marker. Even when you're using a paintbrush, you're touching the surface. With an airbrush, however, you're not touching the surface. Even when you're doing fine lines, yes, you're up close, but you're still hovering over the page or the substrate that you're working on. And this is why airbrushing is so hard to get the feel for, and this can definitely be frustrating for someone who's used to using a brush, a pen, pencil, anything that's touching the surface when you're creating your artwork. So to help to make airbrushing a little bit easier, I like to use my hand as a guide and rest the airbrush on my hand, and then that way you can keep your height the same and you've just got a bit more of a steady hand if you are doing fine detailed work. Now this is obviously provided that you are able to lean up against your work. This might not always be possible, and if you are doing something that's automotive, I recommend that you wear some gloves, but it's a lot easier than just hovering like this. Obviously after quite a bit of practice you'll get the feel for it, but if you just rest your hand, then you can easily get some fine detail, and as a beginner you'll definitely feel more comfortable when you first begin to learn how to use your airbrush. If you're standing up and you want to do some airbrushing, then instead of airbrushing like this, to keep it nice and steady, you can also then lock your elbows in like this, and then you've got a much steadier movement, almost a bit more robotic, and that'll help you to create nice straight lines. So again, if you're working upright, use both hands to steady yourself, but you're still hovering. For finer stuff, you can lean up against the surface, just the same as I showed you before. And again, lock your elbows in if you want to do straight lines and have a bit more control. If you want to space yourself accurately from the surface, then run, say, your finger, and that becomes your guide, and then that way you won't go up any closer and your spray will be consistent, because the height changes the thickness of your stroke as well as the speed that you move and the amount of paint that you apply. Frustration number 2, tip drying. Now if you're painting like this, meaning that you're pressing down, you can hear the air going on and off, and this is how you use your double action airbrush, then you're inevitably going to get tip drying a lot quicker. And what tip drying is, and again, don't copy this method of painting, this is just to show you how I quickly build up some tip drying, just so that I can illustrate this particular tip. And after a while of painting incorrectly, you can see on the tip of my needle there that blob of paint. Now that's called tip drying, and that's caused by not using your double action correctly. So what you're effectively doing is allowing that paint to continue to build on your needle without enough air pushing it through, and that will then continue to dry up. Once you start to get a bit of a blob on there, then it's going to build up more and more as you paint, and you're going to start to see obstructions within your painting. Now to clear off tip drying, you can carefully pick the end of your needle with your fingernail. Just be very careful, because the needles are fine, and if you're running a very thin needle and a softer needle, some airbrushes run softer needles than others, then you could potentially damage it. Once you've picked it off, then you can just blast out a couple of times. If you have a cutaway handle, that will allow you to blast it out as well, but I just do full throttle on the paint, and then that pretty much clears it after picking it off and doing that full throttle. The other method is you can use just a cotton bud or Q-tip and just clean off that paint if you don't want to use your fingernail. You can also spray some Windex on a bit of paper towel and just keep the paper towel nice and loose and just press the needle into that. That's not going to damage your needle, but it will clear off the tip drying for you, and then Always make sure to give it a couple of blasts then in the paper towel if you're using this method, because you could build up some airbrush cleaner on the end, and when you go to press down for air, it could shoot that cleaner onto your work. So be careful of that. And then again, blast it out, and then you can see the airbrush is performing beautifully and there's no tip drying. The real key to minimizing your tip drying is to use your double action correctly. So press down for air, keep the air pressed down at all times, and then pull back for paint, and then shut it back off again. So you want that trigger to return to the home position, and then you let go. So press down for air, pull back for paint, and then let it go back to the home position. So if you do pull back for paint and just let your trigger go, you'll see if I press down for air, I get a dot that comes out. That's the residual paint in there because you haven't shut it off correctly. So what you want to do is air on at all times, put the paint on, and then shut it back off. Paint on, shut it off. So that's how you correctly use your airbrush, and this will dramatically minimize your tip drying. Frustration number 3, not being able to color in properly with your airbrush. So the next thing that can be really frustrating with your airbrush is learning how to color in. Now a lot of people, when they start, they color in like this. They go up to the edges, or they may come further back to try and get it even. But you can see what I'm doing wrong. I'm finding the paint with my trigger. I'm not shutting that paint back off, and I'm just moving around, and this is giving me a patchiness that's going to be very difficult to get rid of. So this is not the way you want to colour in. It might feel easy, and most students start like this, and I'll show you in the next box how to colour in properly. So now, using the correct double action, you can see my trigger finger is going on and off. So every time I finish a stroke, I'm shutting the paint back off. And I want to try and do a 50-50 overlap, which means I'm overlapping 50% on top of my previous stroke. Whenever I colour in, I like to start around the edges. And what this does is it allows me to control my overspray. You can also angle the airbrush if you wish. You can see I've got a little bit of overspray there, but that's okay for the purpose of this demo. And then as I get into this center section, I'm getting into that safe zone so I can move further back from the surface. But if you watch my trigger finger, it's still going on and off, meaning that not on and off with the air, but keeping the air on and just paint on, paint off. And this is allowing me to get a nice even tone. You can also mask up a section. That'll make it really easy to get a nice flat tone, but that's not always possible, so that's why I wanted to show you this freehand method. And now if we look at both of these boxes, you can see that this one has lots of lighter areas, heavier areas, very, very patchy. You can see I can easily outline the darker sections, and it's not a very good colouring in job at all. And this would look terrible if you were trying to colour something in and get a nice flat tone, especially if you're doing, say, a cartoon character. A lot of the time, if you're doing something a bit different, then you may have shadows and highlights on top, and it's a lot easier to hide that. But you can see with this one, yes, there's a few little darker bits and pieces, but overall, by using just the airbrush freehand, that's a pretty nice even coat on that box. So you can definitely see that this method is no good, and using your double action correctly will definitely help you when it comes to colouring in with your airbrush and save you a whole heap of frustration. So even though the airbrush can definitely be very frustrating when you first start out, persist with it. It does take time, and just follow the tips that I've shared with you in this video. Make sure that you're using your correct double action to minimize your tip drying. Use your hand as a guide to help you when it comes to working up close or tackling the hovering of that airbrush. And for the colouring in, keep that air press down at all times and just use your airbrush with a 50-50 overlap to give yourself a nice even flat tone.